Welcome back. In part 1, we explored the cerebrum, the largest part of the forebrain. We learned about the cerebral cortex, white matter, and basal ganglia, and saw how these structures allow us to think, learn, remember, and control voluntary movement. But here's the interesting part. Deep beneath the cerebrum lies a much smaller region that quietly keeps your body alive every second of every day. It regulates your body temperature, controls your hunger and thirst, relays sensory information, maintains your sleep-wake cycle, and even coordinates hormone secretion. This remarkable region is called the diencephalon. In this video, we'll explore its 4 major components. The thalamus, the brain's relay station. The hypothalamus, the master regulator of homeostasis. The epithalamus, which controls our biological clock. And the subthalamus, which helps fine-tune movement. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand not only their anatomy, but also their clinical importance. Let's begin with the largest structure of the diencephalon, the thalamus. Here's a question for you. How does your brain know that something is hot, painful, cold, or even that you're hearing my voice right now? Before your brain can understand any of these sensations, almost every sensory message must first pass through one important structure, the thalamus. Think of the thalamus as the post office of the brain. Every day, a post office receives thousands of letters. It doesn't create the letters, and it doesn't read them. Its job is simple. It receives, sorts, and delivers every letter to the correct address. The thalamus performs exactly the same function. Messages carrying touch, pain, temperature, pressure, vision, and hearing all arrive at the thalamus first. The thalamus quickly organizes these signals and sends them to the correct area of the cerebral cortex, where you finally become aware of them. Without the thalamus, your cortex would receive a constant flood of unorganized information. The thalamus acts like a smart filter, making sure only the right information reaches the right destination. But remember one famous exception. Smell does not follow this rule. The olfactory pathway reaches the cerebral cortex without first passing through the thalamus, making it one of the favorite exam questions in neuroanatomy. Clinically, damage to the thalamus can cause loss of sensation, abnormal sensory perception, or severe central pain, because those sensory messages can no longer be relayed properly. So remember this simple pathway: body, thalamus, cerebral cortex. The thalamus doesn't create sensation. It simply makes sure every sensory message reaches the right destination. Now we've seen how the thalamus delivers information to the brain. But here's the next question. Who makes sure your body stays alive and in balance every second of the day? That's the job of the hypothalamus. Although it's only about the size of an almond, the hypothalamus is one of the busiest control centers in the entire brain. Think of it as the body's smart thermostat or operations manager. Just as a thermostat constantly monitors room temperature and adjusts the heating or cooling, the hypothalamus continuously monitors your body's internal environment and makes automatic corrections to keep everything stable. If your body temperature rises, it triggers sweating. If you become dehydrated, it creates the feeling of thirst. If your energy stores are low, it stimulates hunger. It also controls your sleep-wake cycle, regulates the autonomic nervous system, and communicates directly with the pituitary gland, making it the master controller of the endocrine system. All of these functions have one common goal: maintaining homeostasis, which means keeping the body's internal environment stable despite changes in the outside world. Clinically, damage to the hypothalamus can lead to disturbances in body temperature, appetite, thirst, sleep, hormone secretion, and emotional behavior. So remember one simple idea. The thalamus helps you understand the outside world. The hypothalamus keeps your inside world in balance. Think of the hypothalamus as the 6 T's: temperature, thirst, taste, appetite, hunger, timing, sleep-wake cycle, target hormones, pituitary control, total homeostasis. The final structure of the diencephalon is the subthalamus. Although it's small and often overlooked, it's an important part of the brain's movement control system. Think back to the basal ganglia, which we described as the brain's traffic police. The subthalamus works closely with the basal ganglia as an assistant controller, helping movements remain smooth, coordinated, and accurate. It doesn't start movement. Instead, it fine-tunes movement by preventing excessive or unwanted muscle activity. Clinically, the subthalamus is famous for one condition you should always remember: hemiballismus. A lesion of the subthalamic nucleus, usually caused by a small stroke, produces sudden, violent, flinging movements of the opposite arm and leg. This is a classic board-style question, so whenever you see uncontrolled flinging movements on one side of the body, immediately think, subthalamic nucleus lesion causing hemiballismus. Now let's quickly put everything we've learned together. The forebrain has two major parts: the cerebrum, responsible for higher thinking, memory, language, and voluntary movement, and the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus, the brain's relay station, the hypothalamus, the body's homeostasis manager, the epithalamus, the biological clock, and the subthalamus, the movement assistant. With this framework in mind, you've now mastered the major anatomical organization of the forebrain. Next, we'll explore how all of these structures receive their blood supply, because understanding the arteries is the key to recognizing stroke syndromes in clinical practice. We've now explored the major structures of the forebrain, but none of these structures, the cerebral cortex, thalamus, hypothalamus, or basal ganglia, can function without one essential thing: a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. Unlike muscles, the brain has almost no energy reserves. If its blood supply is interrupted for just a few minutes, brain cells begin to die. So where does this blood come from? The brain receives blood through two major arterial systems. The first is the internal carotid arteries, which travel up the front of the neck and supply most of the forebrain, including the cerebral hemispheres. The second is the vertebral arteries, which ascend through the cervical vertebrae and join together to form the basilar artery. This system mainly supplies the brainstem, cerebellum, and posterior part of the brain. Although these two systems begin separately, they don't remain separate. At the base of the brain, they're connected by an important arterial ring called the Circle of Willis. Think of the Circle of Willis as a roundabout on a motorway. If traffic is blocked on one road, vehicles can often take another route to reach their destination. In the same way, the Circle of Willis provides an alternative pathway for blood flow if one artery becomes narrowed or blocked. Understanding this blood supply is essential, because every stroke pattern you learn later depends on which artery is affected. In the next section, we'll explore the Circle of Willis, and then the three major arteries of the forebrain: the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and posterior cerebral artery. Remember the rule of two arterial systems: internal carotid, anterior circulation; vertebrobasilar, posterior circulation, connected by one Circle of Willis. We've just learned that the brain receives blood from two major arterial systems: the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. But here's an important question. What happens if one of these arteries suddenly becomes narrowed or blocked? Fortunately, the brain has its own emergency backup system called the Circle of Willis. Think of it as a large traffic roundabout. Imagine one road leading into the roundabout is blocked because of an accident. Instead of traffic coming to a complete stop, vehicles simply take another route around the circle to reach their destination. The Circle of Willis works in exactly the same way. It is a ring of arteries located at the base of the brain that connects the anterior circulation from the internal carotid arteries with the posterior circulation from the vertebrobasilar system. This connection allows blood to be redirected if one major artery becomes narrowed or blocked, helping maintain blood flow to brain tissue. However, there's one important point. Although the Circle of Willis provides collateral circulation, it doesn't always completely prevent a stroke. In many people, the circle is incomplete or too small to provide enough compensation. That's why arterial blockage can still cause significant neurological deficits. So remember one simple idea. The Circle of Willis is the brain's emergency bypass system. It connects the major arteries and provides an alternative route for blood whenever possible. Now we've learned how blood reaches the brain and how the Circle of Willis connects the major arteries. But in clinical medicine, one question matters more than any other. Which artery is affected? That's because different arteries supply different parts of the brain, and the symptoms of a stroke depend entirely on which artery loses its blood supply. Fortunately, you only need to master three major arteries of the forebrain: the anterior cerebral artery, or ACA, the middle cerebral artery, or MCA, and the posterior cerebral artery, or PCA. Think of these three arteries as three delivery routes, each responsible for supplying a different neighborhood of the brain. If one route is blocked, only the area supplied by that artery loses oxygen, and that produces a very specific pattern of neurological deficits. That's why almost every stroke question in USMLE, NEET PG, and INICET follows the same logic. Which artery is blocked? Which part of the brain has lost its blood supply? What symptoms will the patient develop? If you can answer those three questions, you've solved the case. In the next few slides, we'll study each artery individually, beginning with the anterior cerebral artery, and you'll see exactly how its territory explains its clinical presentation. Before we finish the blood supply of the forebrain, there's one small group of arteries you absolutely must know: the lenticulostriate arteries. Although these arteries are tiny, they have enormous clinical importance. They arise from the middle cerebral artery, or MCA, and penetrate deep into the brain to supply structures such as the basal ganglia and the internal capsule. Unlike the larger cerebral arteries, these vessels have very little collateral circulation. That means if one of them becomes blocked, there's no alternative route for blood to reach the tissue. This is why they're often called the arteries of stroke. Chronic hypertension gradually damages these small penetrating arteries through a process called lipohyalinosis, making them prone to occlusion. The result is a lacunar infarct, a small but strategically located stroke deep within the brain. Because the internal capsule carries almost all the descending motor fibers, even a tiny infarct here can produce pure motor weakness on the opposite side of the body. So here's the clinical connection. Patient with long-standing hypertension. Sudden pure motor hemiparesis. Think lacunar infarct involving the lenticulostriate arteries. Finally, remember that the diencephalon also has its own blood supply. The thalamus is mainly supplied by branches of the posterior cerebral artery. The hypothalamus receives blood from small branches around the circle of Willis, including the anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery, posterior communicating artery, and posterior cerebral artery. The subthalamus and epithalamus are supplied mainly by branches of the posterior cerebral artery. Understanding these vascular territories helps explain why different strokes produce different neurological syndromes.